Our next guest has been in awe of trees since childhood. In his new identification book, he provides natural history narratives and descriptions for more than 100 species of trees found throughout the state and the Northeast. Let's take note with Charles Fergus, natural historian and author of Trees of Pennsylvania and the Northeast, published by Stackpole Books. Thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
I think one reviewer aptly put it when he said, the author's contagious love of trees shows. You have written a number of books about Pennsylvania's natural history. Why a book on Pennsylvania trees?
Well, it's probably the most favorite book that I've done on Pennsylvania natural history. Why? Because I like trees and I just wanted an excuse to look more deeply into their hidden lives.
What's interesting about this book is it's really not a mere guidebook, because there are engaging natural narratives about these trees and your experience, first seeing them and talking about what they do. What did you have in mind when you wrote it? Because it isn't a typical guidebook.
Well, what I wanted the book to do was to really take up where field guides leave off, so that let's say you know that the tree that's out in the field near your house is a white oak. You can look at the book then and find out the natural history of this tree. Why does it grow where it grows? What does it offer to wildlife? What are some of the diseases that afflict it, the insects that may feed on it? And I also tried to weave in personal stories, just because I think most readers really enjoy understanding why a person may react one way to a tree or another. And I have favorite trees, and I also challenged myself by finding out about new trees that I'd never seen before.
And in fact, there are a number of trees outlined in the book that I've never even heard of. There's a chapter called Odd Others, and among the odd others, Kentucky coffee tree, Allegheny chinkapin, and the one that I'd never heard of, devil's walking stick, and a fringe tree. These are all things that we can really find in Pennsylvania?
They're out there in the woods in different habitats. Devil's walking stick is an odd one. It's got a trunk up to 6 or 8 inches in diameter, and that trunk is studded with needle-sharp protrusions, and hence the name, Devil's Walking Stick.
It doesn't sound like something that we would choose to buy from the nursery and plant in our yards, but you say at one time people actually did that.
That's right. In the Victorian era, it was considered to be the height of fashion to plant this particular grotesque-looking tree in your yard.
And does it have any other interesting feature? Is it, in terms of wildlife, a popular tree maybe?
Well, the one thing that distinguishes it is that it produces a fruit that a lot of animals, particularly birds, feed on.
You mention in your book the tamarack tree, which is the only conifer to shed its needles. So 6 months after it produces them, it drops them, which is so unusual for a conifer. Why does it do that?
Well, first of all, the tamarack, another name that more people will know it by probably, is larch. It's a fairly common tree in Pennsylvania because people have planted it in many places, but it also occurs naturally. It's a little hard to figure out why the tree may drop its needles, but the best explanation that I've read is that it has a very northerly distribution, and at one time the north was quite warm. And so even up as far as very close to the North Pole, this tree was growing. Even though the climate was warm, which it isn't now up there, in the summer, the sun would go away for most of the summer, and it just made no sense in terms of the economics of this tree's life for it to retain its needles through the summer, because the needles couldn't photosynthesize, but they were losing moisture all that time, so the tree evolved to drop its needles and to go into a dormancy during this dark, even though warm, period.
Now, your book describes more than 100 native trees and then another group of non-native trees. Tell us what it took in terms of your research to learn about each one of them. How long were you out in the woods and throughout Pennsylvania studying these trees?
Well, I really divided my time between written resources and authorities on different species and time in the field. I'd never seen a pawpaw tree, for instance, and we have pawpaw trees in Pennsylvania, south central Pennsylvania, probably as far north as Perry County in the Tuscarora State Forest. So I wanted to see pawpaw trees, and indeed I went out and ate fruit off of the pawpaw tree.
And it's not papaya.
It's not papaya, although that's where the name comes from originally. Early settlers mistook it for papaya, which is a Caribbean tree. So I spent a lot of time in the woods, indulging myself in looking at trees and getting a feel for different species and where they grew and what forms they took. But I also spent a great deal of time consulting with historical and also modern sources, historical uses of trees and their wood, medicinal uses, but also modern topics such as effects on trees of acid rain and insect plagues and this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about that. What are some of the major threats to Pennsylvania's trees and forest right now?
I'd say one of the major threats is an overabundance of white-tailed deer. You have many trees now that are not able to successfully reproduce because as soon as they drop nuts and the nuts sprout, well, first of all, the nuts may be eaten. Secondly, if the nuts sprout, the young seedling trees are almost immediately nipped off by deer. So deer are a big problem. These days, when the Bureau of Forestry the State Bureau of Forestry does a timber sale, they have to put electric fencing around the area so that they will get reproduction of trees there. There are a number of insect plagues, including the gypsy moth, that have struck trees over the last half century to a century. Fungal plagues, microorganisms, Dutch elm disease. These are the main threats, but also environmental degradation. And it's hard to say what total effect environmental degradation has. Things like acid rain, acid precipitation. But certainly acid rain and other environmental problems make the other problems worse. They make insect problems worse.
Or drought.
Or drought, exactly, because they put an extra stress on the tree.
Now, you talk in your book about trees as beautiful, intricate, and reassuring. So from an aesthetic point of view, they're obviously something that I think all Pennsylvanians value. But from an economic standpoint, just how important are they? Extremely
important. Pennsylvania is a leading hardwood producing state. We produce some of the most valuable hardwoods in the country. Species like black cherry, for instance. We produce ash, we produce oak. Red oak is a very valuable species right now. So, you know, there's every reason to want to protect our trees from an economic standpoint as well as an aesthetic standpoint.
Now, of course, the state tree is the hemlock. Is there anything spectacular about it to your mind?
Oh, it's a marvelous tree, as are every single species of tree in Pennsylvania. But the hemlock is interesting in that there are some stands of old-growth hemlock still in Pennsylvania. In many cases, they're preserved in Bureau of Forestry natural areas, so we can go to see them. Places like Allen Seeger Natural Area, not far from Center County here, where you have trees that are 100 feet tall and 2 people can barely reach around them. The hemlock is interesting. There's an insect pest called the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is an imported insect. It probably comes from Asia. And some experts suggest that we may lose all of our hemlocks within the next 20 or so years to this insect pest.
And in fact, in Virginia, that's already happening. I was hiking in Virginia and the hemlocks were just literally wiped out.
It's happening in Pennsylvania too.
What's being done about that? I mean, we're talking about the state tree here.
The hemlock woolly adelgid is a difficult pest to deal with. It's I guess heavy rains and also very deep cold can kill it back. But right now I believe that the main emphasis is on bringing in insect predators from Asia to try to hold it in check.
Now, you mentioned these impressive stands of hemlock. In terms of the most impressive stands of trees in Pennsylvania, where would you recommend people go?
Well, one place that particularly stands out for me is Heart's Content Natural Area up in the Allegheny National Forest in northwestern Pennsylvania. Beautiful stands of mixed hardwoods and softwoods, including some really huge white pines. And then the natural areas, and I wrote a book, by the way, about the state forest natural areas, also published by Stackpole, that gives directions on how to get to all of the 61 natural areas, many of which preserve stands of old-growth hemlocks and other species.
And the truth of the matter, though, is that a lot of the woodlots in Pennsylvania are privately owned. How do they compare in terms of how well they're managed and preserved with those that are on state lands?
I couldn't really answer that question. I mean, a lot of private land is in good shape. A lot of private land is cut over very regularly to get the most economic return. In a lot of cases, private landowners high grade, which means they cut out the very best trees, and in doing so they may be removing the very best genetic sources for replenishing the forest. But I couldn't really tell you on an overall scale. I couldn't really compare the two.
You say in the book that you like trees best of all in winter, but is there a favorite tree? Do you have a favorite species of tree?
That's really hard to say. I mean, it depends on the time of year to some extent which tree gladdens my eye the most. One tree that I'm always impressed with and that I think is extremely beautiful is a field-grown white oak. And you will see them very often in farm fields throughout Pennsylvania. In the past, when people plowed fields using livestock, using oxen or horses, they would leave a big white oak in the tree. That tree would grow and spread out its branches and provide shade, so that when a farmer wanted to stop with oxen beneath one of these trees, there would be a nice patch of shade where they could rest.
And I think most of us have seen a tree that, like the one you're describing, just out in the middle of a field and perfectly shaped and provides plenty of shade.
Now that tree will grow totally differently in the woods, that very same tree, because it's going to be surrounded by competitors. It'll be much taller, much straighter.
And not as round and full.
That's right.
How, Chuck, do you hope people use this book?
Well, I just hope that it really sparks people's interest in trees so that they look more carefully at trees, so that they can learn the lessons that trees have to tell us, and so that they can understand the value of trees to the environment.
All right. Well, thanks so much for being with us. What's your next project?
Working on a book about mushrooms.
Okay. We'll look forward to talking with you about that. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We've been talking with Chuck Fergus. His latest book is The Trees of Pennsylvania, which was published by Stackpole Books. For Take Notes, I'm Patty Satalia.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.